Hey everybody, it's Matt here, and today I am going to be talking about Babel-17. Babel-17 is a novel by Samuel R. Delany, and it was written in the late 1960s or 70s. And if you don't know anything about Samuel R. Delany, he is a fantastic sci-fi and fantasy writer from, I believe, where are you from, dude? Are you from Harlem? New York City? Harlem, I told you. He is a science fiction and fantasy writer, but what I have read from him is very different from the loads of other science fiction and fantasy I have been reading lately. And it is very interesting because I think there is a push nowadays for what was already in his fiction so many years ago. And he has been doing something for so long, and yet I don't think nowadays he has the same recognition as he had back then, which is why I want to talk about him today. Samuel R. Delany is a black gay man from Harlem, and he was also born from parents of two different races, and so a lot of times he has people in his life coming up to him and asking him to prove his race. I have read, and I've heard that he just kind of laughs at. If this gives you any sort of sense of what his material is going to be about, I hope it does, because he definitely makes use of it and has some wonderful arguments that he puts forth. But more so than that, there has been recently a big push in literature for diversity, when really I was reading something by Mary Robinette Cowell the other day, Cole, my apologies, and she was saying how it shouldn't be diversity in fiction, but rather it should be realism in fiction, because there is no such place where everybody is of one race or of one sex or gender or sexuality. I think it's very interesting if you look at Babel-17, because this does everything and it was doing it 40-50 years ago. If you want a modern day equivalent to Babel-17, I would essentially say Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang or Arrival by Denis Villeneuve, the film adaptation. It's really just a reimagining of Babel-17, which is really interesting. To give you a little plot synopsis of Babel-17, I will try not to spoil anything. I will just talk about what I love about the book so much. In Babel-17, you have two sides of what we presume to be humanity, but we don't necessarily know. There are hints of other races in this book, but everything is kind of this vague description that doesn't paint an entirely clear picture for you, but that's because he can't. And this makes sense as you read the book. It's very powerfully done. But, and I have recommended this book to my father, and he was like, he didn't understand. He thought it was very funny and very clever that, as a matter of fact, they have three forms of it. I below a temperature of 6 degrees centigrade, I between 6 and 93 degrees centigrade, and I above 93. And this is all just really cleverly done because it's this random species that doesn't have anything to do with the plot, and yet there's this entire sense of depth in world building, which I think overuse of world building is something that a lot of authors nowadays kind of hit you over the head with, and they expect you to just digest it all, when really it should be taken in slow gulps, I think. I'll talk more about this in the future, but Babel-17 really does it very well. It's all situational, it's all done through context, none of it is info dumps, and the moments when they're explaining the language and how language forms thought is so interesting. This book basically takes the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis and uses it to the extreme, which it is a hypothesis that has not been proven in linguistics, but it has essentially fallen out of use because it is unlikely due to competing theories. But we have seen a resurgence of it in modern fiction with Ted Chiang's Story of Your Life, and the movie adaptation Arrival. So there are a lot of people nowadays playing with it, and even Ted Chiang has another story, Understand, in his collection, which has to do with a language which basically gives you the opportunity to unlock your thoughts. And that's essentially what Babel-17 does. Basically, it is a code from the other side of the war, and the military hires this main character, Rydra Wong, who is a poet and very galaxy-renowned linguist, essentially, and they hire her to decode this, and as she's trying to decode it, she realizes it's actually a language, and then the plot goes onward from there. But it is just an incredibly rich world. It is something that you wouldn't expect from a book with this type of almost premise. You wouldn't expect what you get from this. It's very deep and rich, and it's about human love and innocence and sexuality. It is about just expressing oneself and being oneself, essentially. There is this trio of characters that pilot a ship, and in order to pilot a ship you have to be able to fight each other well, and you need to love one another and understand one another. Two of the three cannot understand the third because she speaks Swahili and the other two don't, and only Rydra can communicate with her, and so they have tiny little lessons to enforce communication between them so they can pilot the ship better, and then they like fall in love, and it's such an innocent topic that is typically misstrewn as polygamous and disgusting in our society, and that's not what it is here. It's totally utilitarian and necessary of what these people need, and it's just absolutely gorgeous the way it's done, and I just totally recommend it. It is for anyone who is big into languages and linguistics and just loves anything that just takes languages and has fun with it. This book is that in its entirety. There are passages which are just entire rants, pages that are sentences, and it is just an absolute roller coaster ride for anybody who just loves playing with the Saber-Whorf hypothesis, of course, but just loves seeing language interact with the brain. I will be completely honest though, and I was telling this to my dad before I recommended it to him. The plot of the book is kind of fuzzy, and yet I almost think it was intended for this, but I don't know, because it could have just been me. It's weird. It's a weird thing. I don't know why I had such a problem gripping the plot of it. I think I was just more so through it for the characters, and just because the concept just kind of like, I picked it up and ran with it and just thought it was amazing. I was very much moved by the book and inspired by it, but you may read it and think nothing of it, and I think that is the same with any recommendation of fiction. But nonetheless, I think it was absolutely wonderful. I do think it does take a certain type of tolerance for the type of language that's used. It's very poetic and lyrical, but I think this gives you a sense of Rydra's personality and how she views the world, and I love that as she decodes more and more of Babel-17, the prose begins to shift, and you see this way that she's analyzing the world more, because it's changing the way her brain functions, and it's little clever devices like these that Delany plays with that are just absolutely magnificent and powerful in this book. It's a very quick read. I have a physical copy at home, but that's the one on my Kindle. The highest recommendation I can give for something that you might think is outdated, but it's totally not. I think it is among the highest grade of science fiction, and it's just because it's imaginative and playful, and I think that's something a lot of science fiction doesn't get. A lot of science fiction is hard and rigid, and while this is hard and rigid, it still has a fun time with it. I just mean it doesn't take givens as givens, essentially. It doesn't say that space travel is like this, so this is what space travel needs to be like. Technology was still at the point where things were uncertain as to how they were going to be. This was written before the moon landing, or it was published, so therefore it was written before the moon landing. And so, honestly, the way in which he envisions space travel is one of my favorite methods that I have seen in fiction. And so, I'm really interested to hear what you think about it. Again, it's a quick read, and it's refreshing, I think, hear stories of such diversity and reality being told in an age that was so not that, and because that is what the current push is today in fiction, you know, make everything diverse, make everything equal, but just make it more real, essentially, and that is what Delany is real all the way through. Delany's protagonist is an Asian woman who I don't know if she's gay. I think maybe a little. It's just beautifully done, absolutely gorgeous. I give this a 5 out of 5 over on Goodreads, and I will link to it below if you would like it as well. I think it is absolutely wonderful. I can say that as much. It won't mean anything. I think I'm going to go further on analysis and perhaps comparing Babel-17 to Story of Your Life and others. Perhaps more specifically Arrival and how Arrival used aspects that were played with in Babel-17, but we will see. This is basically just my review of Babel-17. I think it is an absolutely wonderful ride, and it's good for I think it's good for starting out with Delany. Of the books of his I've read, this and Nova. I need to get to Dahlgren. I do think I prefer this to Nova, but they're really different books, so it's hard to say. It's hard to say. Definitely. Anyway, Delany's fantastic. If you're going to take anything away from this, pick up some Delany. He is a charm. I have not seen a lot of him in print recently, but he's being revived in print, which is good. I've slowly begun seeing new editions of some of his books pop up in Barnes & Noble under Vintage Publishing, which I think is under Penguin, which is good because I love those copies. They're freaking gorgeous, these copies. And yeah, that's all from me. Thank you very much for watching, and I will be back next time with some more book stuff or other things. I don't know what to... Do you like this lighting? I kind of think it's nice. It's kind of ambient. It might not be there all the time. It works, I think. I don't know.